Hi guys, my name is Rob Shine, and we're going to talk about classes versus IDs in CSS. So let's first start by talking about classes. The class selector is, first of all, it's indicated by a period in the CSS. So like at the end of this text here, I've got dot content. That is how you reference it in CSS. The class selector is applied to any element that has a class of the same name in the web page. The class selector is therefore not unique or restricted to one element at a time. So if you have dot content as a class, so you've got multiple elements with a class of content, then everywhere where that occurs on that web page, the styling you're using is going to be applied to every instance on that web page. So let's look at a quick example of class selectors here. So this comes from W3 Schools, very useful for JavaScript, CSS, HTML tutorials, examples, very, very, very useful. So we'll notice here that there are 3 lines that are highlighted yellow and 1 that's not. And we've got CSS at the top that's saying wherever we see a class of intro, put a background color of yellow. And down in our actual body of the HTML here, we've got a div with a class of intro, 2 lines of paragraph text, and then a paragraph with that's not in any div or any section or anything like that. Then we've got 1 more class for a paragraph that's also called intro that also has some content after it. So first thing to notice here is that it doesn't matter what element the class is associated to. We've got div class of intro and paragraph class of intro. And every paragraph element within them where we see that class is highlighted. It doesn't matter that they're different elements. There isn't a rule where, okay, so the first class of intro is a div, that means the rest have to be a div. It doesn't matter. You can use paragraph here, you could use section or whatever. So let's go ahead and look at that example up here real quick. So let's say we wanted to change this up a bit, which I actually had done ahead of time, but let me undo it here real quick, and I'll kind of show you what I was getting at. So it originally looks something like this. We've got these 2 highlighted together because they're in the same class of intro, and then the unhighlighted one, and then the next one highlighted because it's also in the class of intro. So let's say we want to add 1 more line here and run it. You'll notice that we get another line and it's all highlighted together. Notice there isn't a space between the highlighted lines because this entire class is containing these 3 paragraph lines. So let's go ahead and try to add another element here. So let's use a section of intro, and then we will close said section here. So let's go ahead and move this line down into the section. And we'll change this a little bit to make it a little more transparent, and we'll run it. So you'll notice now that there is white space between the second and third line because we're in a completely new class now. But you'll notice that it still stays highlighted because the class is still the same name. So that's kind of how the class works in a nutshell here. So let's go ahead and move on and talk about IDs. So ID selectors are unique, first of all. You can only have 1 ID of a certain name per web page. So with the classes where we had 2 or 3 instances of intro, if we're using IDs, you can only have 1 intro per web page. The ID selector is indicated by the hash character, hashtag icon here too. So just a reminder of that, not mix them up in your CSS or anything like that. So where IDs differ because my first thought when I first learned about IDs in classes, I thought, well, it's kind of weird. Like, what are the reasons I only want to have one ID when I could just use classes for styling and such, right? And the main reason is because IDs are used by JavaScript and can have certain browser functionalities and JavaScript functionalities associated to them, where classes may not be able to do the same thing. So, for example, the get element by ID function that we've seen in this class is literally just getting the value of an element by an ID. So without the ID, our code isn't going to know what value to look it up from. If a class, for example, has three classes of 3 different values, your styling will probably be fine. But if you're trying to look up what the value is, you can't. There's 3 of them. The ID lets you look up the value because there's only going to be 1 per web page. Another possible browser functionality that you can do with IDs, which is kind of neat, is like if you've ever clicked on a link that directs you to a certain part of a web page, or like a certain part of a video, perhaps, it's basically using IDs to say, like, when you click on this, navigate to an element of a certain ID that's specified. Maybe you want it to go to like a certain article of the page, or like if there's a function that's like back to the, like, click this to go back to the top or back to the header or something like that, then we can use IDs to kind of use like JavaScript to perform some of these functions. So let's go ahead and look at an ID example. This is also from W3 Schools, and you'll see the text is all very similar. So we've got our class of intro still, and then 2 paragraph lines that each have an ID. One has got an ID of first name and the other has an ID of hometown. In the CSS at the top, we're only worrying about ID first name, and we're giving that the background color of yellow. So you'll notice that only the first name one is highlighted. There's only one. Only one can be highlighted since we can't have multiple IDs. So let's go ahead and take a look at that real quick. And I've been playing around with it too. So let me go ahead and put it back to normal for just a moment here. That'll be good enough. So the screenshot I took had first name up here. I just have hometown now instead. And you'll notice that it highlights the second line where hometown is instead of the first line that I have in the PowerPoint here. So another thing we could do too is like if we were to add first name and want to give that a background color as well. Oops, that's not how that works. Okay, say we want it to be green. Then by doing that, we can identify each ID individually like this and style it or reference it however we need to. So a way that JavaScript uses this that I want to show that we've been doing in class already a bit. So this probably makes sense to a lot of you already, but it's still a good example to look at, I think, is our dates. So we've got, so this is just my work in progress page where we've got today's date up here and we've got like the last modified date at the bottom. Now, our JavaScript needs to know where to put these things. It's one thing to calculate it, but once it's calculated, it needs to know, okay, now what do you want me to do with this? Where do you want me to put this? So let's look at my code for a moment. I think it's here. Yep. So this is my JavaScript file that's calculating those 2 date values. The first one is our last modified one, which is just right here, where we're looking to query our selectors. We're looking up a selector and we're looking up specifically #updated. So a selector, or sorry, an element with the ID of updated. So if we go into my HTML, we'll notice that in the footer, maybe I can zoom in and make it a little bigger here. I've got last updated and then my colon. This is where I want to put it. And here's my ID of updated. So that JavaScript function knows, okay, I need to go look up updated and I need to put that value right here. And it's the same thing with the one in the header. So the one in the header, I've got at the bottom here, we're looking up today instead. So we're looking up an element with the ID of today. And that is right here. Looks very similar. Today's date, colon, and then our element ID of today. And you'll notice that here's today's date, colon, there it is. And the same thing down here. So that's how JavaScript uses IDs to know where to put certain values that we calculate, whether it's like a date or like a math equation or whatever we need to do. We can always reference IDs like that and know where to put them. And we can also use the getElementById function to pull values that are in certain IDs that we're looking for. So that should be about it. That's classes versus IDs. Hopefully you guys have learned some practical uses or just a good refresher that you can apply to your own assignments and your project this semester. So thank you for listening.